Hi folks, David Michael Phelps here with another episode of Working Man. Today we'll be playing you a talk given by Harmel Academy's president and co-founder, Brian Black. Brian gave this talk in the fall in Traverse City, Michigan, to a charitable organization named Martinus. In it, Brian does a deep dive into the meaning of work, and if you're interested in taking a look at the philosophical DNA of Harmel, if you want to spend some time examining the movement and gears of the clock that is this academy, this is the talk for you. As we move into this second season of Working Man, we'll be supplementing our normal interviews and discussions with lectures and talks like this one. So please let us know what you think of it. I hope you find it helpful in your work. So without further ado, here is Brian Black.
Thank you all. Thank you to Kathy and to Bridget for putting this together tonight, and to my host, to John and Danielle for also helping with putting this together. 4.5 years ago or so, my partner, Ryan Pohl, my co-founder, we decided to get serious about addressing a need that we felt we had seen in the world for young men to get training in the skilled trades while not neglecting their continued formation as a Catholic man. So the idea with the school is very simply is that we bring young men onto a college campus, Kuiper College. You did very well. That's exactly how it's pronounced. They live as college students. So it's a residential program. They learn skilled trades. We have two designed right now. One is electrician program, and the other is a manufacturing program. And we'll be adding additional programs after that for welding and diesel mechanic, HVAC, and so on. But in addition to learning a skilled trade that's in high demand, we also have a humanities curriculum where they enter into a fuller understanding about what it is to be a Catholic man. So it's an integrated curriculum, and it's a single class that actually lasts 2 years. So the entire course is a 2-year course, and our program is 2 years. So rather than breaking out philosophy, theology, history, literature, and so on separately, we mix it all together, and then we walk through it thematically. It's a very innovative program. And then the third part, of course, is just living in community. These guys growing together as a community of young men, and then helping each other be called to higher standards in their lives. So it's an innovative way of helping young men make the transition from high school into a life on their own. So, for example, it was Monday or Tuesday, we started the day with an hour-long class on the history and the development of the divine office and the logistics of praying a shorter Christian prayer. So that was in the morning. And at the end of the day, I was giving them lessons on the advantages of using a hammer versus using an impact driver and the physics of screws. So that kind of gives you a range of what we're trying to accomplish with these guys. They loved it. So then right before we left, the college has given us use of a room there, which we're converting into an oratory. It had been a computer lab. And so the guys were in there, this is one of the reasons why I was explaining the use of a hammer, demolishing this computer lab and throwing stuff out the windows, and putting it in a pickup and hauling it away. And in that activity, that's when I forgot to bring the handout. So my talk has 6 short parts. After a quick introduction, part 1, what is the social question? So the title of my talk is Work and the Keys to the Social Question. So the first question is, what is the social question? It's a term the church uses. Part 2, I'm going to attempt to define work. What is work? Part 3, how should we work? Part 4, well, now what do we do about it? And part 5, if there's time, how should we live? And then part 6 is questions, time for some questions. And I do promise to be attentive to my time. So after college and after joining the church, my wife Diane and I are both converts. We joined the church immediately after Hillsdale. I wanted to stay in my hometown in Ada, down near Grand Rapids. I wanted to get married and have a family. So despite my degree, I was attracted to working with my hands. So I started a landscaping business. I worked for a few home builders and was an electrical apprentice. Much time to be confident of that decision. I came from a professional family, and it didn't really fit real well culturally. So I got into corporate product marketing for about 7 years, but through God's providence, I was led back to the trades, where until just this past January, as she mentioned, I specialized in historic building restoration. And over that time, it was clear that the reputation of the trades and young men's interest in it had quickly waned. With nearly every customer I spoke with, I did sales and project management, we would at some time have this conversation about the dearth of skilled tradesmen, the decrease in work ethic, and how not everyone should go to college. And I'm sure you've probably all had conversations similar to that. But it was funny, my customers, most of whom were themselves professionals, would not engage my recommendation that their own children could pursue the trades. They'd say, oh, no, he's going to college. I found that people were eager for other people to fix their house rather than their own children. At the same time, almost every day with a supplier or a colleague or a coworker, we would have a conversation about just how we can't find good help. And again, you've probably had similar conversations in your own life. And really, no one cared to get into our line of work. So I'd be talking to our supplier for shingles, and we were talking about how nobody wants to work anymore. Over that time, I became aware of a number of things. First, people do look down their noses at those who work with their hands, unless, of course, their toilet's plugged or the roof leaks, and then you're welcome. That young people were not aware of not only the financial opportunities of the trades, but of its ability to provide truly satisfying work, as I had experienced. And finally, that there was a generation of young people who are normally accused of being lazy. They just have no idea how to work, or worse, why to work. A few years ago, as a quick story here about my experience at Grand River Builders, we hired a young man who was late every day for his first week. The owner of our business approached him with that, but then he noticed that this young man had sort of a confused and expectant expression on his face, not an expression of shame or embarrassment, which is what we were expecting. And he was sort of looking like the young man was saying, where are you going with this? And then the owner realized, he said, well, you know that you have to be on time for work every day, right? And the young man said, no, really? Okay. So once they got that figured out, this young man was not only never late again, but he usually got there first and became one of our hardest working masons. As an aside, this young man's father was a successful medical executive, but the young man just literally did not know how to work, how to engage the world of work. Now that you have some background about me and how I came to be attentive to the ideas of work and Catholicism, I want to be sure to highlight that there is a thing called Catholic social teaching. It's a body of teaching about work and Catholicism. When I was teaching my oldest daughter economics class, the textbook referenced an encyclical I'd never heard of called Rerum Novarum. And that one is also in the handout, so you know how to spell it correctly. The textbook was saying all these crazy things about workers' rights and solidarity, and I thought, no, that can't be right. So I scoffed and told my daughter to just keep going on the textbook. But I did go and get a copy of Rerum Novarum. Lo and behold, this encyclical walked me through a vision of the working man that turned my world upside down, or actually right side up. I could not find anything, and I tried, that was in conflict with the Gospels or my understanding of man. If I wanted to be a good Catholic, that I said I was, then I had to assent to this teaching in the same way that my wife and I had assented to Humanae Vitae. I had to defer to that teaching and not ignore it, as I had advised my daughter to. I might not like it, I might not fully understand it, but it was the orthodox, unchanging view of man that the church had always taught. So my talk here will draw on this body of teaching, Catholic social teaching. In general, and specifically, I want to talk about the 1981 encyclical Laborum Exertions, which was issued this week, 39 years ago. John Paul had intended to issue it in May of 1981. Does anyone remember what happened to John Paul in May of 1981? Yes, he was shot. So he actually finished compiling Laborum Exertions from a hospital bed, and it was released in September. So part one, as I mentioned, what is the social question? What is the problem? As you know, the church has developed our faith in response to challenges. It's developed its Christology in the early 60s, and it developed its Mariology in the same way. The church has developed doctrine in response to challenges of Islam and Protestantism, and so it is with work. The Industrial Revolution that swept the world in the 18th and 19th centuries created new conditions of work and displaced the old order of workers in the economy. So in response, Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Rerum E01. So Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII, 1891, Laborum Exertions, John Paul, 1981. In fact, Rerum Novarum, the title means new things. As with all church teaching, Rerum Novarum stands on a solid foundation. Leo did not start from scratch. Rerum Novarum was, however, the first great, what we call social encyclical. As European Christendom disintegrated, the need to comprehensively address work and social conditions arose for the first time. Local economies were dissolving and being replaced by a complex global commercial order. The change was revolutionary. Europe had already survived waves of revolution, and by 1891, it was clear that it was not going to be a passing storm, but a permanent change. So that's the history major in me coming out. Leo was challenged to teach Catholics how to see work in a new way. Through the 19th century, schools of revolutionary thought were proposing their own views of work, so Leo knew that he needed to affirm the Catholic vision of man as worker in Rerum Novarum. The challenge was that the challenge for Leo, and indeed the challenge for us in our own times, is that work is at the same time so close to us and so far from us that we have a hard time actually seeing it or conceptualizing it and appreciating it. It is close to us because it is so essential to us. It's a given, and so much so that through the ages, the church never needed really to give it much thought or propose much teaching on it. And this is how it was. But it is also far from us, mostly because of technology. It brought great advances that mean that nearly every output is interconnected with a global network of work and creativity and distribution, leaving us unable to really understand clearly what work is. And this is how it has become, and is still so today. Who can really appreciate the technology of even one small commercial transaction now? Not only in the manufacturing of the item, but its shipment, order processing, and so on. So Leo began a thread of teaching in Rerum Novarum, 1891, that has been developed since in documents that each refer back to Rerum Novarum. The documents that are in line from Rerum Novarum, only one of them is not an encyclical. So these are authoritative teachings. So what's the social question? What's the problem? The system seems to be working. While the 19th century industrialization brought with it all sorts of social problems, slowly we seem to have improved a lot of these. Billions of people have been brought out of extreme poverty. And while we can't say things are perfect, economically speaking, aren't we better off than we've ever been by orders of magnitude? Even if work isn't clearly understood explicitly, can't we say that we must be doing something right? And shouldn't we just keep moving forward? Well, here's the problem with that strategy. What if you think work is an object to manipulate, as we seem to do, but it is not, in fact, that? What if you think that it is an objective thing, but it is, in fact, a fully human enterprise, fully integrated to being human? What if we have it all wrong, in other words? Well, then we risk the tyranny of a system that we've created at the expense of the persons that it is meant to serve. So then, aren't there great risks in not deeply pondering the nature of work? And as a brief aside, you may have already noticed that this course of understanding is a social challenge, and the church takes it up, clarifies it, issues documentations. It can also be seen in the recent flowering of the understanding of marriage. Revolutionaries had gotten their hands on marriage too, and the church responded with Humanae Vitae, and more recently the so-called theology of the body teachings of John Paul. So keep that analogy in mind. So part one in conclusion, what is the social question? The social question is about modern work life. And the church has an entire body of instruction called Catholic social teaching. So part two, what is work? Why is it important to understand it? And how do we experience it now? Leo XIII laid the groundwork 130 years ago, and now I want to focus on the fourth encyclical developed out of Rerum Novarum, Laborum Exertions. It's 42 pages long, written by Pope St. John Paul II in 1981, and that was on the occasion of the 90th anniversary year of Rerum Novarum. And as I mentioned, there are copies of that available for you on your way out. So that was 39 years ago. So John Paul writes in the very first section, quote, "I wish to devote this document to human work, and even more to man, in the vast context of the reality of work." As you know, John Paul had been a worker himself, and in 1981, the world was still in the grips of Soviet communism before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which would then be 10 years later. The Solid Poland was founded the year before, in 1980. So Laborum Exertions is no academic encyclical, but was firmly grounded in the contemporary issues and crises of his time. Section 1 says this is a longer quotation. "Work is one of these aspects, a perennial and fundamental one that is always relevant and constantly demands renewed attention and decisive witness. Because fresh questions and problems are always arising, there are always fresh hopes, but also fresh fears and threats connected with this basic dimension of human existence. Man's life is built up every day from work. From work, it derives its specific dignity, but at the same time, work contains the unceasing measure of human toil and suffering." So you'll notice that he makes a distinction between work and toil and suffering. Returning to the quote, "and also of the harm and injustice which penetrate deeply into social life within individual nations and on the international level." Notice he intends to deal with all aspects of work, from the personal all the way through to the international level. Then in section 3, he states this theme: human work is a key to the whole social question. And that's the line from which I got the title of this talk. Or, as G.K. Chesterton put it back in 1918, the most dangerous of all forms of ignorance is ignorance of work. So what is work? How can we define it? Well, it's not in the entry for the 1913 Catholic Dictionary. I looked for it in the Catechism, the Catholic Church. So here's my working definition: applying human effort to transform or alter a natural condition. So applying human effort to transform or alter a natural condition. We are always working. We're working right now. You are working listening to me. I am working speaking to you. Apart from sleep, everything we do is work. Work is what we do. We can't avoid it. Even the most luxurious people must work in some way. They have to get out of bed. They have to eat. Remembering this keeps us from thinking about work only in terms of making money or our job, although that is primarily where the understanding of work is applied and will be the focus of our study of the social question. So how do we experience work now? I propose that we have it all wrong. We see work as bad. We use phrases like nothing but work, work, work. We are told that mostly by billboards and resort owners that our real goal is retirement or the absence of work, on a chair at the beach with your attractive partner. Now, don't get me wrong. I, like all of you, enjoy being on the beach with my beautiful wife. We say things like, work is for people who don't know how to fish. In our time, we suffer from an objectification of our labor from our person. Let me say that again. We suffer from an objectification of our labor from our person. We often see our labor as something we do apart from who we are. This term, objectification, you may recognize from the scourge of pornography. In the same way that pornography objectifies a person's sexuality, separating it and exploiting it, so can our work be objectified from our person for exploitation. This can also be called disintegration. We pull it apart, as it were. We pull the person apart and exploit different parts of him for gain. This disintegration or objectification has two consequences for ourselves and many consequences socially and economically. We have taught ourselves to see work apart from ourselves. And as a consequence, can decide that we either don't like it or we like it too much. As an object apart from ourselves, we can have a separate opinion about our work and externalize it. Because work is often toilsome, as we talked about, we easily conclude that it is a bad thing out there. Now, in my own experience, I have a quick story about objectification where work is perceived as out there and bad. As an electrician, I had been taught by a journeyman on a particular day to run a certain conduit in a certain way to make it look good and it'd be efficient for pulling wires, and learned a lot that day just in this run of conduit that was running across the ceiling. And the project manager came on site and said, "Bad news, guys, change order. They now want to run it the other way or a different place." I don't remember exactly what the change was. And I felt bad. I just, geez, that's kind of a nice run of conduit up there. You know, I had put myself into it. And the journeyman working with me says, "Hey, it's your buck. You pay me either way. I'll take it down and do it some other way." And it completely didn't faze him at all. And I remember thinking at that time, it was probably 26, 27, that I don't like that response. I mean, it felt strange to not have some attachment or affection for the work that you just completed. And I suspect all of you have felt that in your lives. Anything from a hobby like gardening to your professional lives, that was good. That was a good thing. So that was an early experience. I, at the time, didn't know what I was concerned about, but looking back on it now, I think that's what was happening there. Or the displacement can also result in identifying ourselves too much in our work. So this electrician completely detached himself from his work. On the other hand, work can become who the self is, where we love work. And this leads, of course, to careerism, workaholism, pursuit of a good job that fulfills us. The job does the fulfilling. I think the perils of this are a little more obvious, and perhaps we even know people like this, and they're usually characters in movies and so on. And it's often easier to perceive this disintegration where someone works too much rather than the other. So those are the two ways that we can disintegrate from our work. So has working ever been how we would want it? It's easy to romanticize the past and imagine a golden age of farmers and tradesmen leading integrated lives of work. But work has always been alternately physically demanding and boring. It has always been unstable and dangerous. But it is true that there was a more natural integration of the person to his work in the past. We see it even in last names like my own, like Black or Smith. For good or not, you were what you did. And your position in the economy and the community were more clear and certainly much more static. That static order, in fact, was one of the things that revolutionaries wanted to change. How have we dealt with this work to solve these problems? In the past, it was the toil and the hardship that were the most obvious. Think of coal mining or farming. But now it seems to be more the disintegration. Mostly we have attempted to alter the actual social systems of the work itself. First, we tried to avoid it by enslaving others to do our work. Second, we tried to control it by rebuilding the entire social order around centralized worker planning, as in communism. Third, we've tried various ways to transform it, usually through utopian communities or in our own day technology. And finally, we have always tried to medicate the problem away, drugs, alcohol, both at work and at home. Each of these attempts have some intrinsic good, but all of these attempts to deal with work look to control work rather than ourselves. Now, is this how Christ would want us to live as workers? As Catholics, how do we go about addressing work? What does the incarnation and the redemption mean for work? How does God intend us to work? We need to always re-examine work under changing social conditions, which require different strategies over time, or as John Paul said, work, quote, constantly demands renewed attention. So in conclusion, part 2, What is work? Well, it's understanding the integral nature of work as the key to the social questions, the integrity of work, and it needs constant attention and witness. Part 3, how should we work then? As with any challenge like this, we must start with the person, the subject. That's the term that John Paul likes to use in this context. He writes, the basis, this is Laborum Exertions again, section 6, the basis for determining the value of human work is not primarily the kind of work being done, but the fact that the one who's doing it is a person. So the church understands that, if you're a radiologist, it's the fact that you are a person doing the work rather than how much you're paid for the work. And perhaps the most succinct and powerful phrase in Laborum Exertion, he writes, work is for man and not man for work. Here is a quotation worth memorizing, a motto, if you will. With that simple sentence in mind, work is for man and not man for work, our way forward toward understanding how we should work becomes a simpler one. And it is worth repeating that this is not a new teaching. So John Paul was not making something up here. It is not as though the church had never pondered this question before. He's building on not only Rerum Novarum, as we've said, but also on the course of the entire tradition of Christian anthropology, from Augustine through Thomas and on through modern theologians. So with that phrase in mind, let's connect my definition of work to it. The definition now, as we said, was applying human effort to transform or alter a natural condition. I'm going to revise it to say applying human effort through the gift of our bodies to transform or alter a natural condition, that is, the gift of creation. John Paul made it one of his missions as Pope and theologian to amplify our understanding of the idea of gift, that all is a gift. Creation is a gift, our bodies are gifts, our faith, gift, Christ's redemptive suffering and resurrection were all gifts. All of existence is an exuberant act of love. It's an exuberant gift. If we can imagine back to the garden before the fall, there are clues on how work is not only a gift, but how it was meant to integrate with our person. And to confirm that this is precisely where we can benefit from a close look, John Paul wrote about the Garden of Eden. God's fundamental and original intention with regard to man, whom he created in his image and after his likeness, was not withdrawn or canceled out, even when man, having broken the original covenant with God, heard the words, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread." So the original intention with regard to man was not withdrawn or canceled out after the fall. So we look back to the garden for guidance. There were 4 primary gifts in the garden. There was creation, the garden itself, our bodies made in the image and likeness of God, marriage as a gift to reflect the love of the Trinity, and the gift of pure faith. The 4th one, of course, being lost at the fall. Everything else survived, but in a broken condition. So creation, our bodies, and marriage all fell, but still are gifts from God. To understand the integrity of work, I'd like to review the original integrity of marriage. So I'm going to draw back to that analogy about marriage. Marriage is a relationship between 2 persons and their bodies. You can't have a virtual marriage. We have all grown in our understanding of this understanding of 2 persons, 2 bodies, under the guidance of the church in the last generation. Since Humanae Vitae, the church's voice on marriage has been more clear, made so by the challenges of modern life. She has proven to be completely correct when Paul VI predicted the social disasters that would accompany contraception and divorce. And I'm sure you've all read Humanae Vitae, and those predictions are quite chilling. The strength of this understanding comes from the understanding of marriage and bodies as gifts. And when we live in accordance with what they are, we do God's will and are happy. And I said that marriage is a relationship between 2 persons and their bodies. I propose that work is a relationship between ourselves, our bodies, and creation. Now we can see the structure in the garden, the exchange of the gift of selves in marriage, and the exchange of the gift of self in creation in work. So there's 2 exchanges happening there, and as gifts intended by God. By now you may be thinking, hey, that sounds like the theology of the body. And you would be right. Theology of the body has made contributions in our understanding of marriage, and particularly sex in marriage. What I'm proposing here is what we call theology for the rest of the body. Listen to this quotation from John Paul. Marriage is a good thing for man, a good thing for his humanity, because through marriage, man achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more a human being. Classic John Paul. We've come to expect that from him. Except what he actually said in Laborum Exertions was this: work is a good thing for man, a good thing for his humanity, because through work, man achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more a human being. I think it is fruitful to keep this parallel between marriage and work in mind. So understanding the integral nature of work is the key to the social question, needs constant attention. How should we work? We should embrace work as a primary, original gift for man. On to part 4. What do we do about it? How do we help solve this social question? If you're wondering if all of this pondering about work has any bearing on the people around you, so we've been talking mostly about our own work, John Paul says this: it is characteristic of work that it first and foremost unites people. It is characteristic of work that it first and foremost unites people. And that's a kind of an odd thing to say. I remember the first time I read that, I thought, that's an entirely new idea. Work should unite people. It is a common effort among people. This is as much a social question as a personal one. Indeed, in the Catechism, instruction about the nature of work occurs in the entry on "Thou shalt not steal." The subheading is titled Economic Activity and Social Justice. The Church teaches that work is not a matter of personal morals, but a social one. When we think about our calling as workers, we must at the same time remember that our work touches on everyone else. Work then clearly involves economics. How do we arrange things for economic exchange? But it also involves politics. How do we arrange the power of the state? Work involves us, our families, our neighbors, our nation, in fact, the entire world. And as he said, as a reminder, this quotation was, work serves to add to the heritage of the whole human family. So what do we do about it? First, we must tweak how we see the relationship between the objective aspects of work and the subjective. So instead of seeing the director of sales, so there's a chair here that says director of sales on it, as a position in your company, an object into which you place Charlie, or the subject. Instead of asking how the subject, Charlie, serves the object, the chair, think first about the subject, Charlie. We are called to enter into a relationship with persons. So that's the first point of recommendation, is it requires a little bit of a flip in your mind to remember that you're always dealing with persons. As our own position as a customer, both parties need to be subjects. You are a person, not a customer, and we must be ready to not fall into the same problem on the other side of the counter. And here it is important to foster as much as possible conditions or relationships that support a personal exchange. So I pay more when I shop at my local hardware store, Ada Hardware, where I've shopped since I was 10 years old. Both my sons have worked there, and I've gone to the funerals of some of the owners when they've passed. And in a conversation with one of the workers there, whom I've known for over 40 years, we ended the exchange. I bought a paintbrush with this observation relative to COVID and the day that was before us. We said, all we have is each other. That kind of relationship, so I'm paying a higher price, in this case for the paintbrush, highlights that all relationships cost us something. And it needs to be true in buying and selling as it does in marriage. So the marriage relationship costs something too. By the way, this is the same store where if you leave, if you call them before the store closes and ask them, they will leave items for you in a bag behind the bush outside the back door. You just pay for it next time you're in. So personal relationships build personal service. And as another observation, recalling what we've said about subjectivity, when a small local family business like this closes, that's when you feel the subjectivity and the full integration of the human person the most. And expecting that all of you have had a similar experience in your own life where a family business or a local business has had to close. Then, finally, we do something about the social question in the economy at large and its arrangement. It is helpful as a parallel to remember that our culture is only a collection of families, so a good culture is a result of good families. So, in other words, we can't boycott our way to a Catholic culture. We have to build it one family at a time. So, in the same way, we can't impose any kind of economic structure and expect that to solve a problem. That's the problem the communists made. The church is very clear that she does not favor any particular economic system or arrangement, but she does, of course, vigorously promote the correct understanding of man and his work. Quoting John Paul again, it is respect for the objective rights of the workers that must constitute the adequate and fundamental criterion for shaping the whole economy. And this is where I had failed when I first encountered teaching economics to my daughter. I like to think of it this way. When the church challenged slavery, she did not propose an economic system to replace it. She simply taught the gospel that all men are created in the image and likeness of God, and to own another person was to objectify him and deprive him of his dignity. So as the gospel spread, slavery simply disappeared. Our mission as Catholic workers is to first understand that what the church teaches about work and the worker, and second, to simply live it out as well as we can. And yes, we need to work for a more just economic and political system based on those values, but exactly what that may look like will not look at all what it used to look like. So trying to restore a previous arrangement is a fool's task. As part of an examination of this modern challenge, the Second Vatican Council addressed this in Gaudium et Spes. All that people do to obtain justice, wider brotherhood, and a more humane ordering of social relationships has greater worth than technical advances. So it's very clear how the church sees that relationship between technology and the person. And never forget that we Catholics carry with us some pretty crazy ideas. Blessed are the poor comes to mind. Our radical gospel message must permeate everything, including the economy, our work, and politics. Let me end with a quotation from C.S. Lewis from The Four Loves, speaking of work and the garden. It is no disparagement to a garden to say that it will not fence and weed itself, nor prune its own fruit trees, nor roll and cut its own lawns. It will remain a garden as distinct from a wilderness only if someone does all these things to it. But heaven forbid we should work in the manner of prigs or stoics. While we hack and prune, we know very well that what we are hacking and pruning is big with a splendor and vitality which our rational will could never of itself have provided. To liberate that splendor, to let it become what it is truly trying to be, to have tall trees instead of stubby tangles and sweet apples instead of crabs, that is part of our purpose. Here are some final words from Laborum Exertions. In fact, the closing words. Let the Christian who listens to the word of the living God, uniting work with prayer, know the place that his work has, not only in earthly progress, but also in the development of the kingdom of God, to which we are all called through the power of the Holy Spirit and through the word of the gospel. This is our mission at Harmel Academy, to teach young men the place that work has, not only in their earthly progress, but also in the development of the kingdom of God. Thank you. Any questions? All right. Yes.
I was just thinking about the concept of socialism, capitalism, and its impact on this whole concept of work.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So socialism, capitalism, and the concept of work. The key thing to understand there is what the church teaches about ownership. And the church teaches that socialism is, or what they termed liberalism, is a sin, that socialism deprives man of his right to private property. So in true socialism, only the state owns the means of production, and deprives man of his God-given right to private property. So as an economic system that is specifically condemned, as is communism. Apart from those two, any others that are named I'm not aware of, but it is very clear in the church's teachings, in all Catholic social teachings, that the right to private property is inalienable. And in particular, they stress the importance that man owns the means of his own production. So the closer that a man is to owning what are his tools, basically, the more Catholic, so to speak, it is. And of course, socialism and communism, those are the opposite. So thank you. Yes.
I was wondering what you thought were the reasons why those fewer people are entering the trades.
Yeah.
And a little general gist of if we were speaking with our sons and daughters of, how to evaluate going to university or community college versus going into the trade, how you
Sure. Yeah, so why are the trades, why have they fallen in respect, correct? And what would we say to a young man who's considering the different options before him? The first thing that comes to mind is something at Harmel we call the tecton advantage. And in Greek, tecton means maker. And it's a term that is used for both St. Joseph and for Jesus in the Gospels. Joseph and Jesus were both workers. We often translate it as carpenter, but the term could have meant many other different things. I prefer to think of it as worker guy, maker. That's the first thing I would mention to them. We're called to imitate Christ in all that we do, and what better or more direct way to imitate him than to work with our hands, as he did for 30 years before his public ministry. We tend to forget that. We always want to jump ahead to the baptism where the plot line picks up a bit. But he toiled with St. Joseph for a very long time with his hands. And it's always good to remember that he didn't have to do that. God could have chosen something else, God the Father, for him in his incarnation. He could have been a scribe or a Pharisee or any number of scholar, any other kind of work, but he chose working with his hands. And I think that's a guide for us. Not always, but for myself, working with my hands, that was something I would call to mind, usually rather than losing my temper or something like that. It's just, this is what, listen, I'm not as though this is some pious reflection, but deep down, that's really what can help motivate a worker, a guy who's working with his hands, is that you're actually imitating Christ. So I would put that in the fore of the conversation. After that, I mentioned, as I said, that the work's extremely satisfying, work in the trades. You can enter into it without debt, in this, unlike going to college. And as I said, it pays well. And there's a lot of opportunity right now in the trades, in all areas of the trades. So I would focus on that in addition to, and Laborum Exerciens is actually not that difficult of a read. And that might be something to read through and reflect on even before that conversation. So it's a good question. Yeah.
One thing I've seen about it, because it changed in my generation right at college, was, what do you do? I'm a stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. That's not work. That's where it was looked at.
Sure.
And I still feel that's even more so now.
Mm-hmm. And
I'm wondering, how do you teach to that?
Sure. I would go right to the understanding of work. So the question about being a stay-at-home mom and that not being work, right? Do you work? No, I'm a stay-at-home mom. We have this conflict. From my own experience and knowing my audience, waving to my lovely wife, who is also a stay-at-home mom, I don't think there's any more difficult job than a stay-at-home mom, period. Looking at that, what could you say to a colleague or a peer about that? I think I would just say that the work of the home, the domestic work, is the primary work. And again, to draw the analogy to the Holy Family, I would look at the Blessed Mother and say, I believe she was a stay-at-home mom. And, not to, use that as a weapon, but just go ahead and plant that flag in the ground and say, that's a pretty good standard to imitate there. And then the nurturing and the value of a wife who stays home with children is, it's literally immeasurable. And I think the culture has caught up to that. I mean, even the secular sociologists and anthropologists have noticed that the value of a woman who stays home with children and works from the home is incalculable for domestic health, for the economy, for every measure. But apart from that, I mean, really, the biggest thing would be to just the spiritual aspect. And apart from that, I guess I wouldn't want to have the conversation on their terms. Like, how much money you make working outside the home versus how much money I make being at home is not the ground on which to have the conversation. I would shift it over to the spiritual realm. Yes?
How many students do you hope to eventually be able to have here?
Yes. Our campus limit is 300, simply because we want to keep the campus small enough, or the school small enough, that we know all the guys. But we're right now planning on a cohort of 25 students every year as we build towards that.
And you advertise through the Catholic high school?
Yes. Yep. So we've been meeting with the diocese in our state. We have students from, right now, looking at our school and interviewing from Houston, from Rochester, New York, from Denver. We have a student from Jordan who's actually in the military on deployment, San Diego, Chicago, and then a good amount from Michigan also. Yeah. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Even though the focus of our programming at Harmel is the skilled trades, the discussion of work and its relationship to holiness is relevant to everyone. And part of our mission is to help people better hear the call to holiness, the call of God in their own work. So please consider sharing our podcast with your friends, with your priest, with your coworkers. And if you could take a moment to leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it really does make a difference in appeasing the algorithm and helping us find new audiences and new partners. So thanks much, and we'll see you soon.